started. I'm Kelly Sullivan. I teach literature in the faculty here at Glucksman Ireland House, and I want to welcome all of you to Glucksman Ireland House. There are lots of familiar faces out there, and lots of new faces too. So, before I get started introducing Caroline, I just wanted to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and also that we have a reception after the event downstairs. And there are not books for sale, but you can order copies of the book through the Tramp Press website. I think they'll ship from Ireland, or you could wait until the spring when they're available in the US by employees. So it's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Heafey tonight. It's especially nice to introduce her now because as our former administrative aide, Caroline was involved in organizing and putting together so many events like this. So it's fitting that tonight she gets to be the one standing up here in front of you. Caroline completed the MA in Irish and Irish American Studies at Glucksman Ireland House in 2016 with a thesis on Dorothy Macardle's prison writings. As a graduate student, Caroline was remarkable for her drive and her ambition, and for already having a strong sense of the field of Irish studies and where her own work might fall within it. She discovered Macardle as an undergraduate at Fordham University, where she majored in English and French, and at NYU she wanted to continue researching this largely overlooked writer's fiction and her journals and publications from prison. It was only shortly after she completed the MA here that Caroline told me she and the editors at Ireland's Tramp Press, Sarah Davis Goff and Lisa Cohen, discussed the possibility that she would write the introduction for a forthcoming reissue of one of Macardle's novels. And so it's a real pleasure that we get to celebrate the republication of Macardle's 1953 Dark Enchantment in Tramp's Recovered Voices series and Caroline's role in it. In her introduction to Dark Enchantment, Caroline points out that the author uses her protagonist's financial situation as a reminder of the bleak options available to women even post-war. Caroline highlights a limiting binary between domesticity and social mobility. Yet, as in all Macardle's novels, any political or moral commentary comes packaged in an instantly compelling story. 3 of her 4 novels are Gothic, kind of in the vein of Daphne du Maurier, I would say, and they regularly feature ghosts and the supernatural. In The Uninvited, an unfulfilled spirit mourns and haunts a house newly purchased by an Anglo-Irish couple. In The Unforeseen, actually they're not a couple, it's a sister and brother. Anyway, in The Unforeseen, first published in 1946, a woman suffers from debilitating paranormal foresight, yet Macardle doesn't rely on the supernatural or the paranormal to explain away human cruelty, political conflict, or the great lengths to which individuals will go in the name of belief. In Dark Enchantment, the element of the supernatural and the sinister reminders of the very recent events in occupied France set up a plot in which seemingly benevolent characters judge someone believed to be unacceptably different from her community. In her introduction, Caroline argues that the ethical focus of the novel is its ability to force us to think about what it means to be an outsider, a social outcast. Turka, a Romany gypsy woman who fought with the French resistance, now finds herself ostracized from the rural French community of Saint-Jacques. As other critics have suggested, Turka offers a neat parallel to the position of many Republican women in Ireland in the post-revolutionary period, women who found themselves dependent on and at the mercy of a state withholding from them the very rights they had fought for in the anti-colonial struggle. Caroline's interest in reinstating Macardle to her central role as a writer and thinker in 20th century Ireland links this novel to the author's current position as something of a literary outsider. As a graduate student at NYU, Caroline was always attuned to overlooked women writers whose work had fallen out of print. She introduced me to Macardle's fiction, and soon I was teaching The Uninvited in graduate courses. After her time here, Caroline began a PhD at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she continues her research on Irish women writers, modernism, and trauma studies. She also teaches first-year writing and works as the marketing manager for the literary journal Paperbark. It's through the recovery work of literary scholars like Caroline Heafey and committed small presses like Tramp that we can bring Dorothy Macardle and other forgotten voices back into the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Caroline Heafey back to Glucksman.
Very surreal in kind of the best way. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. All right, just checking. So So I'd just like to begin by saying thank you first and foremost to Glucksman Ireland House, NYU, to Kelly for that wonderful and very generous introduction, to Kevin and Miriam for organizing tonight's talk, to Amber and Dave and the marvelous team of student workers here. I know very well that the house could not function without them. I'd also like to extend thanks to Jolie, to Kelly, and to Miriam as well, especially for their support through this project, and of course to Loretta, Brennan, Glucksman, and the board here at Glucksman Ireland House. As Kelly pointed out, the recovery of Dark Enchantment began when I was a graduate student here, and really could not have happened in this way without the resources that Glucksman House provides to its students. And I'm eternally grateful for all that I learned here at One Washington Muse. So someone asked me the other day, why Dorothy Macardle? And of all the writers to focus on, why choose her? And I'll admit that I was somewhat taken aback by this question, just in that it's never really been posed to me in quite that way before. And I hope that by the end of this talk I will have clarified somewhat why I think Macardle is worthy of our attention in the 21st century. I've split this talk into two parts. So one, I'm going to talk about Macardle just kind of generally, providing some background information for those who might not be as familiar with her life and her work. And the second half, I'm just going to talk about recovering the novel a bit more broadly and kind of my research methodology of what that process looked like. So, here we go. So who was Dorothy Macardle? This is her, just there. Macardle was born, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead here. Macardle was born on March 7th, 1889, to Thomas and Minnie Macardle in Dundalk, Ireland. Her father was a Home Rule supporter and the affluent head of the Macardle Brewing Company, which remained a quite affluent company well into the 20th century. Minnie, her mother, was English, Protestant, and believed in raising her children to respect the British Empire and all that it entailed. For some historical context, I'd just like to frame Macardle's life and some other key developments that occurred or were occurring around that time. Actually, if I can go back. So, in 1889, when Macardle was born, Queen Victoria is the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister is Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil, the third Marquess of Salisbury. This is the same year that William Butler Yeats meets Maud Gunn and publishes The Wanderings of Oisin and other poems. Harry Clark is born, very relevant to Kelly Sullivan. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington become states in the United States. The Savoy Hotel in London opens, and I point to this in particular to kind of signal a transition that's beginning to take place between the 19th and 20th centuries, the Savoy ultimately becoming an icon really of the 20th century and the arts in particular. We can signal this this time period as really the end of Victorian England and the height of the US Gilded Age. And for just a frame of reference, it's 2 years before the White House installs electric lighting. So if we flash forward then to 1958, the year Macardle dies, we have a very different scene. Ireland has been divided into a republic, and Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom. That republic has a Taoiseach, Éamon de Valera, as well, and Éamon de Valera in this year also visits the Vatican for the coronation of Pope John XXIII. It also has a president, Sean T. O'Kelly. It's the same year that Brendan Behan publishes Borstal Boy in London, though it's banned in Ireland due to the censorship board. And we can observe the growing influence of the Catholic Church and its reaches of conservatism here, alive and well in 1958. Beckett's Crapp's Last Tape is performed in London, a play very much concerned with the integration of technology and the art of recording and auditory sound. Irish writer Roddy Doyle is born. Peg Sayers and Paul Henry writer and painter, die. And NASA is founded in the United States. So we've gone from 2 years before electricity is installed in the White House to the launch of a satellite into space and the dawn of the space program in the United States. Macardle saw 2 world wars, war in Ireland, an Irish Civil War, and the resulting violence that remained on the island of Ireland throughout the 20th century. Macardle herself was raised with a tremendous amount of privilege. Her family's affluence afforded them trips to the continent of Europe and London. Importantly for Macardle, that educational advantage largely unavailable to women at this time. Historian Leanne Lane notes in her recent biography of Macardle, that's just out actually last week, from UCD Press, that Macardle's high level of education, quote, and exposure to culture gave her the intellectual understanding and confidence to live a very different kind of life, being able to negotiate between a professional and private life in the 20th century, which was quite rare for women at the time. And this differentiates her further too from some of her other revolutionary counterparts, like Rosamund Jacobs, for example. The Macardles can be seen as an example of the Catholic upper class that's emerging in the late 19th century after the famine of the 1840s. The forward thinking that Thomas and Minnie demonstrated in providing their daughters with advanced academic training, in particular, would become the foundation for Macardle's ability to navigate that social context that placed preference for women to remain within the home. And in Ireland, with the passing of the 1937 Constitution, we know that women were actually legislated into the home once they were married, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So as such, Macardle graduated with a first honors degree in 1912 from University College Dublin, although Lane notes that Alexandra College was offering third level lectures to women at this time as well, which Macardle would have attended. That integration between Alexandra and UCD further speaks to the newness of educational opportunity for women during this time. And it's worth noting that Alexandra was quite pivotal for Macardle in facilitating her access to education and to knowledge at both secondary and third levels. Ultimately though, Macardle is dismissed from teaching at that institution for her political activism and outspokenness against the Irish Treaty. Alexandra would have been definitely rooted in a more imperial stance socially. So when 1916 broke out in Dublin, Macardle's actually absent. She had family members fighting in the Somme, in France, and in London at that time, was focused on finding them when they went missing, and she was teaching in Stratford-upon-Avon, which allowed her to do some research into Shakespeare, who was one of her many literary loves. This absence, though, becomes a real insecurity for Dorothy Macardle, especially as she becomes more involved politically in Cumann na mBan. And that lack of involvement in 1916 really hastens her radicalization. She becomes deeply influenced by the poetry of W.B. Yeats, plays at the Abbey, which she eventually writes for as well. And she actually, she lectured in a series with Yeats. She was focusing on Shakespeare, he was focusing on his own poetry, but it would have put them, perhaps typically, it would have put them in sort of similar social circles at this time. And she has a general heightened awareness of Irish history that she wasn't necessarily exposed to as a child due to her mother's influence and her mother's English heritage and English pride. So when Macardle returns to Dublin in 1917, she took a teaching position at Alexandra, and notably in this year, her play Atonement debuts at the Abbey. Leanne Lane also notes that this attention to this debut and her connection with the Abbey puts Macardle on the radar of other revolutionary women, Maud Gunn and Countess Markievicz. Jumping forward a few years, in 1922, Macardle begins working with Erskine Childers to produce Unpublished, and through this work, he really becomes a mentor for her, and she's quite devastated ultimately when he is executed. In fact, it's also Molly Childers who encouraged Macardle to write the propaganda called Irish Freedom, which ultimately resulted in her arrest on November 9th, 1922. And for the subsequent 6 months, she was imprisoned between Mountjoy, Kilmainham jails, and the North Dublin Union. So Macardle's time in prison was one of immense trauma that remained with her for the rest of her life. From within cells, she and her fellow women prisoners could hear shots outside signaling the executions of fellow Republican activists. There were hunger strikes, beatings from officers, and arguably other forms of violence against women that had not been explicitly documented. Reading into these moments provides more context for the kind of experience that it was to be a woman imprisoned in Ireland in 1922 and 1923. During her time in prison, Macardle kept a jail journal, which helped inform personal accounts that she published as propaganda. I find that propaganda often has something of a negative connotation associated with it, but the reality is that for whatever purposes these writings were published, they help us piece together a larger understanding of the experience of being in prison during this time, and especially as a woman. I'm just going to read now from some of her writings. In one of these entries, she describes the transfer of prisoners on hunger strike from the North Dublin Union to Kilmainham and the attacks that they endured from their resistance. Macardle writes, "The men seemed skilled. They had many methods. Some twisted the girl's arms, some bent back their thumbs. One who seized Iseult Stewart kicked her on the stairs with his knee. Florence McDermott was disabled by a blow on the ankle with a revolver. When my own turn came, after I had been dragged from the railings, a great hand closed on my face, blinding and stifling me, and thrust me back down to the ground among trampling feet. I stood in the passage then, waiting for the girls to be flung out one by one. None were frightened or overcome, but many were half fainting. One man had thrust a finger down Moira Broderick's throat. Many of the men were smoking all the time. Our instructions not to hit back had been well obeyed. The wardresses were bringing us cups of water. They were crying. The prison doctor looked on smiling, smoking a cigarette. He seemed to have come for entertainment. He did nothing for the injured girls." She then concludes that the entire ordeal of transferring the women from one prison to another with these beatings took 5 hours. It's important to note that these women were demonstrating solidarity peacefully with Mary Mc Sweeney, who was then on hunger strike at the time, and the other strikers because of the risk that it posed to their physical health, the transfer itself. Macardle notes that McSweeney in particular was prone to sudden collapses and heart attacks, and that the notion of leaving her alone with the prison guards was unthinkable. Their refusal to be transferred from Kilmainham jail to the North Dublin Union was less about an act of civil disobedience, although that would certainly be appropriate here as well. But it was more about a demonstration of solidarity and support between women and among women. And I think we see that too with the wardresses trying to offer some kind of comfort. So, while as a historian it might be remiss to speculate on the kind of treatment that women that we can glean from these accounts, I'm going to do so anyway. The degree of pleasure that can be seen from the guards and from the jail doctor in particular at watching women suffer is alarming. Given the degree of physical abuse that we see here, I think it's a fair estimation that there was sexual abuse occurring as well. That went undocumented. Especially in the age of Me Too that we are living through and seeing the outpouring of stories of sexual assault and misconduct that women have endured for years and silently, I would argue that it is a safer assumption to make that abuse of a sexual nature did occur here rather than to assume that it did not. The way that Macardle depicts the doctor in particular, the kind of voyeuristic pleasure that he demonstrates watching these women beaten to the point that some of them pass out, smoking a cigarette as though he's kind of taking a moment at leisure. There's a fair inference to be made about gaps has become an essential component in my research methodology and working on Macardle. And I'll speak more about that in a moment. But for now, I'll just say that in my experience working on recovering the life work of a forgotten writer or figure, and in particular for those who have been forgotten due to gender, racial, or class biases, it's essential to read for what is being unsaid just as much as what is documented, quote unquote, authoritatively, so to speak. Given the degree of trauma that Macardle experienced firsthand, the physical experience of being in prison alone in an overcrowded and damp cell, surveyed by men at all times, then couple that with the sounds of gunshots outside the cell window, listening to determine whether or not these shots were specifically an execution or merely target practice, spending each day locked up, isolated, and in the moments of release or transfer, subjected to excruciating physical abuse, it would be impossible to walk away from these 6 months unmarked, so to speak. Still, in the moments in between, Macardle found time to write. She wrote a collection of short stories called Earthbound, 9 Stories of Ireland, which she published upon her release in 1924. These stories are folkloric in nature, a strong example of the nationalist writings coming out of this period of Irish revivalism, and written about the War of Independence, but with the hindsight and perspective of the Irish Civil War. The final story, for example, includes a vision of a soldier in a green Free State uniform in a dream. And dreams become very important to Macardle. I'll just read a bit from that story as well. So at this time, the frame of Earthbound is that people are telling stories of back home from a living room in Philadelphia. And Macardle, the final story includes a woman called Nesta telling about a dream that she's just had. So Macardle writes, "Her face had gone white and her eyes wide and dark. Better not be telling it," Frank said. But she crushed her hands together and said, No, I'll get rid of it. I'll get rid of it. 'Tis better for me to tell." In this dream, I was not present myself. I know in a way that I was asleep. There was a mad feeling that if only I could wake, if only I could cry out, but I had no power. There were high stone walls and a dark yard. Everything was cold. It was dawn. The yard was full of stones. It was narrow and long. There was a dark hole dug in the earth. There was a man standing near it against a wall. His hands were behind his back and his eyes were bandaged. There was a bright red mark over his heart. It was Roger. He was going to be killed. Soldiers formed up with rifles and stood covering him. There were 9. I counted them. It was all quite clear. Then a tall man stood behind them. I looked at him and tried to scream. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. I had no power. He was the dead man. He had a great scar on his brow and hollow eyes, and that long, cadaverous face. I heard him shout, "Fire!" and heard the volley, and saw Roger fall, and saw that man go over him with his revolver and shoot. Oh, it was horrible. I can't. She broke off. For a while, none of us could think of anything to say. She goes on, and then Nesta, the narrator, says, "There was one thing that showed how it was, just a crazy combination of hopes and fears. The uniforms of the soldiers were green. That comforted me, of course. But the first part of the dream came true." End of quote. The story goes on to tell of a wounded man entering the house before it concludes, and Nesta says, quote, "You see, the war will break out again, of course. We all know that. But the green uniforms, it couldn't come true." End quote. Macardle then signs off the story and the collection with Mountjoy, December 1922. The exploration of dreams unrealized or morphing into horror and violence in this story are fairly obvious. Nesta has a dream that ultimately comes true, in part, but can't imagine that the soldiers executing Irish Republicans would ever don green uniforms of the Free State. Of course, given the date and the locale, we know that the rest of her dream is in fact realized. Furthermore, writing from the confines of Mountjoy, for her very activism against Irish division prompted by the treaty, only adds to the rather thrilling conclusion here. I think it's notable too the repetition of a woman saying, "I have no power," twice in one quite short sequence, a kind of reading into what it must have been like to be in that prison cell as well. So Macardle's interest in dreams unrealized and the notion of trauma and foresight remain a focus in her writing for the rest of her life. Indeed, the violence and trauma that she witnessed and endured appears in her interest with psychoanalysis, and specifically women's experiences of trauma in the novels from the 1940s and 50s. In The Uninvited, a young protagonist, Stella, depicted as a rather dreamy figure, becomes temporarily incarcerated in a psychiatric facility against her will. In The Unforeseen, the novel's protagonist, Virgilia, has visions of violence against her daughter and fears losing her mind until she ultimately learns how to harness these visions in order to prevent that violence. Then, in Dark Enchantment, as Kelly has kind of already outlined, Macardle explores the concepts of socio-political violence and its specific effects on women. The potential to ostracize or label a woman as a pariah, unfit, violent, or evil because of difference seems a timely and intriguing theme. In Macardle's 1949 exposition, Children of Europe, she traces the impacts and psychological effects of war on children across the continent of Europe, and notably it's published only 4 years after the end of World War II. So it's a pretty significant tome that was compiled quite quickly, but also quite comprehensively, and published kind of for the immediate reaction to that kind of violence we're seeing. In her essay on Padraig Pearse, originally written as a broadcast for RTE, but published posthumously in The Shaping of Modern Ireland by Conor Cruise O'Brien, Macardle writes about Pearse as a dreamer and reflects on her own disillusionment with the Irish Republic as it was realized and developing in the mid-1950s. It's clear that the dreams that Macardle had for the Irish Republic were indeed never realized, and her disappointment here is clear toward the end of her life. Now, shifting perhaps to a more positive note, Dorothy Macardle is perhaps also famous, or most famous, for her involvement with Hollywood. Her novel, The Uninvited, was made into a film in 1944 by Lewis Allen. The film garnered a great deal of success. It starred Ray Milland and Gail Russell. It's still available through the Criterion Collection if anyone is interested in viewing it, and it's what I would call a fairly haunted classic. More notably, too, is the composition for the film Stella by Starlight arguably became more successful indeed than the novel and the film. It was covered by many musicians in the 20th century, but most notably Miles Davis and Ella Fitzgerald. So, with all of this attention, it's hard to imagine how Dorothy Macardle somehow faded into the ether of forgotten history. I would argue, perhaps at the risk of oversimplification, that she probably wouldn't have if she had been born a man. The 20th century in Ireland was not kind to women and legislatively sought to exclude women from public life. So, the 1937 Constitution, enacted by Eamon de Valera, directly legislated that a woman's place should be in the home. Considering that the 1916 proclamation that incited the 1916 rebellion and what would become the Irish Republic quite radically and inclusively addresses both Irish men and Irish women, the 21 years in between demonstrates a swift conservatism that's taking over the state and lasting really until fairly recently. It's worth noting as well that this article, 41.2, is still present in the Constitution, and Macardle actively spoke out against it when it came out, putting her fairly awkwardly at odds with Eamon de Valera, who she was good friends with and was godmother to his son. Coincidentally, in the same year, she publishes her tome of Irish history since 1916, The Irish Republic, which features a preface from de Valera. So we've got this sort of strange moment where her kind of comrade in Republican ideology is not supportive to her ability to access that ideology. Legislation in Ireland from the mid-1930s onward is primarily about controlling gender roles, at least around women. Contraception is legal in the Republic from 1935 to 1980. The 1937 Constitution makes divorce illegal as well, which remains in effect until 1995. Mother and baby homes and laundries maintain a grip of silent power over women's bodies until 1996, kind of in the periphery. And most recently, the right for women to procure an abortion, outlawed since the 19th century, remains illegal until just last year in 2018. I want to make note of these legislative initiatives as a way of considering how women were valued in Ireland during this period, the period that forgot Macardle. A woman who was never married, who never had children, and who never embodied the image of the Irish woman as it was being manufactured during this time. She just kind of didn't fit. Macardle's fiction was also often seen and marketed as a kind of chick lit, glossed over as lovely travel narratives or fun ghost stories, but a lot of reviewers kind of neglected to read further to consider some of the social critiques that she was making through her fiction and at this time. So this brings me to my second part of the talk, finally, a discussion about the recovery process. So I first, as Kelly pointed out as well, but I first encountered Dorothy Macardle writing when I was an undergraduate at Fordham University at Lincoln Center. I was studying English and French and really trying my best to resist this passion I had for Irish literature. But I was indulging in a minor credential in Irish studies just the same. And I was reaching the end of that qualification, the minor in Irish studies that is, and it occurred to me that at the end of my third year, I really hadn't read any Irish women writers, perhaps with the exception of Mariah Edgeworth. I remember visiting the Irish Writers Museum in Dublin and walking through the exhibitions, and next to the texts of each of the writers, there were little relics as a kind of homage to their intellect and their creative ability. Next to Brendan Behan's books, for example, I believe it was his typewriter. Next to some of Yeats' manuscripts, I think they had his spectacles or something of that nature. I reached a display upstairs in this kind of brilliant room, old Georgian house, devoted to Mary Lavin. And the relic they chose for her was a teddy bear. Now, there are a lot of readings that you could make into that teddy bear, right? You could argue that Mary Lavin's fiction is, explores a lot about domesticity and relationships with mothers and children, etc. But for me, it felt fairly incomplete or not enough. And I came home to New York, and I decided that for the next year, I was only going to read Irish women writers. And thankfully, under the direction of Dr. Anne Fernald, who is here this evening, the Fordham English department made that a possibility for me. And by the end of that year, I was still so intrigued by this Macardle figure, enough that I applied to the master's here in Irish Studies at NYU and at Ireland House. I had the intention of doing a research project exclusively devoted to her and to her writings. And I hope that I've kind of answered the question as to why Macardle, why she is interesting. So again, I was tremendously lucky to find the support and interest here in this house, under the supervision of Kelly and Joe and Miriam as well, for this project in particular. In my experience, so much of the ability to recover a writer comes from support. There needs to be someone looking at a student or a scholar saying, follow your gut. This work feels important, even if it's not clear yet as to why. So much of recovery work feels a lot like you're searching around in the dark, hoping that you ultimately find something that feels a bit more concrete. And it sounds a bit nerve-wracking, but it's also one of the most enjoyable parts of this process. And the more I've researched Dorothy Macardle, the more intrigued I am by her life, some of which I've discussed here tonight, and I haven't covered all of it, but some of it. She in many ways contradicts herself. She was this radical and ardent Republican political prisoner, though somewhat unliked at times by the women she shared a prison cell with. She was labeled a snob and pretentious, and to be honest, she probably was. Given the affluence of her upbringing, I have no doubt that she had certain class biases that perhaps were being unraveled during this period. She spoke out against Dev's administration and maintained her friendship with him and his family despite that tension. She's not a figure that fits neatly into a box, which I think makes her so much more interesting and so much more intriguing as we continue to uncover what's going on with her work. So, Dark Enchantment is the third novel that Tramp Press has published. The work that Lisa Cohen and Sarah Davis Goff have done has been integral in generating attention and readership throughout this process. To give you an idea, when I was beginning my research only about 7 years ago, a huge part of that work was actually finding access to the texts. So I found access to Earthbound, I believe because Anne emailed somebody that we found in a bibliography somewhere and asked for a PDF scan of the text itself. This was very minimal, just there were no archives involved, it was just, yeah, a Hail Mary looking to actually be able to read something by her. There was nothing in print to read, nothing, and certainly not in the United States. I could seek out used copies, but they were largely unavailable in the US, and certainly undergraduate students don't really have the resources to purchase rare first editions. The work was foremostly excavational, and I had to determine if the works were even still in existence to be able to consider. Now, a few years later, 3 of her novels are being regularly distributed in Ireland, the UK, and in America, taught by Kelly here at this house. An edition of Earthbound was released recently by Swan River Press in Dublin just a few years ago. Leanne Lane's brilliant biography of Macardle that just came out last week is available and is I'm delighted with because it's an actual text that can be referenced instead of bits and scraps from archives. And there are numerous stories that have appeared in numerous anthologies, all within the past 5 to 7 years or so. The difference that 7 years can make with a lot of work and conversations is really quite astounding, and cannot happen without the willingness to trust that archives and the canon as we understand it is always going to be pretty insufficient the way that they stand. So I'll just close with some reflections about where we might continue this conversation, looking to the next project and looking forward other excavation projects. In working on Dark Enchantment and Macardle more generally, the way that I have conceptualized the archive and the canon have changed dramatically. I think that often I'll use that collective we carefully, but we are taught in school that there are certain writers more worthy of our attention than others. And that may be true, but it is so essential to consider how we select these writers, how we teach them, how and why we read them. There's tremendous power and privilege in seeing a writer who you identify with or who looks like you appear on a syllabus. That visual reaffirms the importance, the relevance, and the authority of a voice. The absence of a woman, a person of color, a person of a different gender identity, that gap is actually an act of violence, right? In the way that it enforces erasure of knowledge. And the ways that knowledge is organized to privilege one person or another is not accidental, right? So we kind of know this. Understanding these biases and accepting that the concept of the archive will always be insufficient creates space to reimagine or start to imagine how to organize knowledge in a different way. I see this imaginative space, the intellectual awareness and openness to reconsider or redefine how the academy exists, functions, and develops as exciting and dripping with the potential for more inclusion, more recovery, and more voices. And now, if there's time, I thought I would read a bit from Dark Enchantment and let Dorothy Macardle have the last word. Is there time? So I'll just read a little bit from the first chapter, kind of whet your appetites, if you will. Chapter 1 is called The Dark Woman. Zigzagging up from the coast, swerving at high speed round dizzying bends, pausing at bridges and crossroads to let burdened, perspiring women descend, the bus climbed in less than an hour, from parched August to fresh September, leaving the pavements and shops of the Riviera for the vines and olive orchards of the Maritime Alps. A sharp turn, and Saint-Jacques appeared, crowning a massive rock high up on the right, a pile of stone-built houses and towers hugged by an ancient wall. Juliet turned to her father with an excited, "Look!" and gazed up again, half incredulous to see a 5-year-old dream come true. It looked scarcely real, hanging there in golden air. She thought of all the times her childish wish to spend a whole day in one of the mountain villages had been almost granted and then disappeared. To do it now, with him, would be the supreme delight of the unimagined, astonishing holiday. Frith's response to his daughter's elation was a grimace. They call that a village. A village perché, she exclaimed. Perched is the word. For another 10 minutes, the vision was one, and trees lined the roads. Then the plains on the right gave place to a towering wall. The bus came to a halt, and passengers for Saint-Jacques cumbrously hoisted themselves, their baskets and one another down. Only a few excursionists kept their seats, bound for the high pine woods and the Gorge du Cheval Mort. Did the bus then not enter the village? Frith demanded of the conductor in his utility French, and Juliet translated the reply, which was poured forth in the patois of the frontier with Italian vowels all over the place. The gate is too narrow. One walks by an easy gradient up to the right, or one takes a shortcut through the wall. The bus grunted, lurched, and went boisterously off again by the tarred motor route on the left, while the local people proceeded toward the village at the steady, accustomed pace. Juliet and her father stood looking about them, taking deep breaths of the pure mountain air, glad to be free of the stifling heat and the crowd. I saw the steps, Frith said, and began to walk back by the way they came. Juliet chuckled. You and your shortcuts. His experiment was a raccourci from Castellar down to Menton, and yesterday had brought them out on the wrong end of town. This narrow passage, however, looked promising. Cut in the thickness of the fortifications, it rose by a flight of steps to the little platform and turned to the right. It must come out in the ramparts, Frith surmised. A wide walk, Juliet suggested eagerly, and a breeze and a gorgeous view. But I'm afraid, she added in a small voice. Her father did not hear, and she did not persist, saying, well, it's a gamble, but here goes. He addressed himself with energy to climb. Frith Cunningham, after 10 days of strolling, swimming, and sightseeing, was in good walking form. He was in good spirits, too. 48 years old and feeling it. In London, he had dropped a year or two, he told himself. In Paris, sunk a few in the Mediterranean, and next week in Corsica, in the best of company, making this crazy film and earning money. He would back himself to shed 10 more. Life might get underway again, and after years in the doldrums, if he could only think what the devil to do with the girl. The girl was hoping he would not look around. She had done a stupid thing, attempting the shortcut. Her heart was behaving like a battering ram. Each step was too high. The only way was to stand for a moment on one before taking the next, pretending to be interested in the small flowers that grew in the chinks in the wall. She advanced slowly, thankful to see her father's long legs striding ahead, and relieved when he reached the top. He stood there, like Hamlet on the battlements, staring around him. Juliet, the last step achieved, sat down on it and kept still until the breathlessness passed. She was pleased with herself. A week ago, she could not have done that. The station steps in Marseille had defeated her. In another week, she would be perfectly fit. And then she shook her head, dismissing all the problem and speculations that might dim the radiance of today. Pulled her hat off, adjusted her scarf so that it would hang over the brim and protect her neck from the midday sun. Put the hat on again and stood up. Well, I'm certainly jiggered, her father said. You'd think some child of a giant had spilled a box of toys on the head of rocks. I suppose this place is 1,000 years old. It was. Do we have time for questions, or should we adjourn?
Kevin?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there any?
Go for it.
We got a book coming out on a 1942 movie and novel, Random Harvest. 2 issues. Number 1, a great book and a great movie. And the tendency is to play one off against the other. Don't want to do that. At the expense of the book, I have to make, the movie look good at the expense. So in a sense, you've got the same situation. And number 2 is, even though it was the number 2 box office movie that year, Bambi was number 1. Casablanca was number 3. It's hard to get people to remember that, whereas Bambi, they never forget it. So there's problems built in with the dangers of going back to the 40s.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's interesting to see how some films remain and some don't. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I guess I was surprised or intrigued by the friendship with Devil Era. I just found it hard to imagine the woman you've described as Devil Era. I know as friends, or Devil Era having friends, maybe.
That's the real shock.
Something about it surprised me, but I wondered, in your research on Dorothy Macardle, what surprised you most?
In general?
About her, or were there surprises along the way? As you got to know her more and more, did more recovery?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about Macardle that surprised me, but I think it's a funny story. It comes from, I believe it's in Rosamund Jacobs' journal, but when she was living with Rosamund Jacobs, she also lived with Maud Gunn for a period of time, which is just kind of a fun fact, but she was living with Rosamund Jacobs. Rosamund was having an amorous relationship with a gentleman, and she found them like sneaking out at a late hour of the night, and she whipped on all the lights and accosted them both on a landing of a staircase and just said, like, this is completely inappropriate, how dare, like this like fierce conservatism coming from a woman who intellectually is also quite not conservative, but I think part of what I like about Macardle is she's something of a product of her circumstance completely, in that she does contradict herself, and she does sort of demonstrate both these radical notions of women's independence for that time, but also the kind of emotional reactions that she would have grown up with. And we see that too with her mother and her mother's influence. I mean, she was raised very much to uphold the British Empire, and that becomes a real issue for her and her mother and her father really as well, especially when she's in prison for anti-treaty activism. So yeah, I think kind of every story that I found just struck me as never really simple. There's always kind of ways of unraveling it and finding more stories that kind of descend out of it.
Maybe a related question, but similarly, her protagonists in many of the books they're troubling sometimes, right? Particularly young women who are always sort of fragile, at the mercy of an adult figure of some sort, even though they're all adults already. And they're almost always, on some level, like romance stories as well. They're not genre fiction, but they're playing with genre. And yet that doesn't undo the more radical readings or the more kind of politically interesting readings that are available. So how do you account for that, or what do you think she's doing with these protagonists who are always like 20-year-old women who are deeply like under someone's thumb?
Yeah. I think it depends on the novel to answer that question really appropriately, but yeah, I mean, like at the end of The Uninvited, Stella, like there's a really troubling ending, not to give away any spoilers, but Stella, the protagonist, is described very much infantilized and very much as this like almost kind of like a child bride situation, which is really unsettling. But as you say, it doesn't undo her role and what's going on with kind of exploring how women become incarcerated in the rest of the novel. I thought about this most recently with working on Dark Enchantment, and I talked about this a little bit in the introduction, of the character of Juliet can be quite disappointing in the way that she doesn't really come to Turka's aid. And you just want her to do that. You want her to see through the kind of social binaries that are working and that are limiting Turka and casting her as an outsider. But she doesn't do that. The way that I kind of reconcile that is that she is still making choices. She's still, even though she is kind of under the thumb of her father or under the thumb of whomever else she comes into contact with, ultimately she does have the consciousness and the awareness of her own role in her life, right? And while she is disappointing in a lot of ways, she's making a decision that is quite pragmatic. And maybe that disappointment is intentional. You know, maybe we are supposed to sort of linger and meditate on what could be.
How did her relationship with her mother in later life unfold? And does that any of that come into play with any of the characters that she writes about? Or does any of that develop that like along those familiar, family kind of?
Definitely, mothers are very important to Macardle in a lot of her novels, and her relationship with her mother was not great, especially as an adult. To my knowledge, it didn't end quite happily. I will say too, there are holes in the excavation work of Macardle because a lot of her papers were burned, actually. So there's kind of only so much we can do. But that said, I think we can do a lot with what we have. In The Uninvited, for example, that novel is about two mothers, one very cold, one who is very warm, like the kind of standard maternal that you want a child to be with. And I think through that novel in particular, Macardle's sort of exploring the damage that a mother can do, as well as the opportunity that can be afforded through those relationships. So yeah, it definitely comes into play in her fiction, and knowing that context, you can see it even a bit more. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering about maybe some of the other influences that Macardle had in her writing. You mentioned Shakespeare and Yeats, but I'm wondering if there are other contemporaries. Obviously, what you mentioned about a professional private life kind of thing, we think of Virginia Woolf. Is there any correspondence or other influences?
No correspondence with Virginia Woolf that I know of, but there's an expert here who's shaking her head, so no correspondence with Virginia Woolf that I know of. But yeah, she would have been deeply influenced by Spenser as well. She published on Spenser. Spenser, Shakespeare, like those are kind of her two guys. But she was reading. It's hard. Like I would love a world where I could kind of assemble a bibliography of everything Macardle was reading and encountered while she's also working on these projects. That just doesn't exist yet. You know, that it might be something that becomes possible, but so far with what we have, it's not. I think it's fair to us. She was very well read though, and she very much prided herself as the kind of cosmopolitan intellectual. So she was reading novels, kind of anything that would have been big at that time. I'm pretty sure she read like Dr. DeMore. You know, like she's reading people who are going to be influential to her work, even if we can't quite pinpoint that. Yes, on this date she wrote in this diary that she's reading X, Y, Z. You know. But yeah, I would say Shakespeare and Spenser. And to that point, you know, if you're reading your novel and you think she might be referencing someone here, there's probably a good chance that she is.
Thank you very much, Caroline. We'll give Caroline another round of applause.
Reception downstairs.
Yeah.
Ooh.
That's right.
Not at all.
You've been in the room with me before. Tell me your name. Hi.
It's nice to meet you. Yeah, I took Dr. Bristow. He wasn't my advisor. I'm in as my advisor. But I took Bristow for 6 semesters. So every semester.
You just kept going back for more.
And I got lucky
that.
because I started in 1, so it was like a special class. So I could take every